Well, welcome everyone. Welcome. It's our first Preptober session of Novel November. Welcome. If you can see and hear me, drop a message in the chat. Say hello. Let us know where you're joining from. Welcome, welcome. Audio and video are good. Thanks for letting us know. Oh, wow. These are coming through so quickly. I see locations just about everywhere. Atlanta, Minnesota, Delaware, Minneapolis, Texas. It is quite late for our European friends, so I'm assuming a lot of our attendees live this evening will be from North America and Australia. So far, that is ringing true. If anyone is here from Europe, you have a lot of determination in staying up so late. Thank you so much. And if you're not here live, you're catching us on the replay, so welcome. All right, we are going to get rolling here. Just have a couple of housekeeping items to share with you, and then we will begin our session. So first off, the Novel November community space, we'd love to have you there. If you haven't joined yet, you can do so with your Pro Writing Aid account details. It is free to join, and we have a special Novel November community space. And in this space, you can view the schedule and RSVP to any upcoming events. We are constantly updating those, so keep checking back for new events that get added throughout this month, November, and then we'll be adding the December event soon. You can also chat with other Nob participants. We have a special chat stream, and then we also have writer circles. You can join as many as you would like. You can also submit Q&A questions for any upcoming interviews or asynchronous AMA posts that we'll have in the community. You can meet our Nov ambassadors and sponsors, and you can access our event replays and session resources. Those replays will be added as soon as our video recordings and transcriptions are finished processing by Zoom and YouTube, and then we can get them uploaded for you. The replay space will also have any relevant links and materials from those sessions, so make sure you check that out. Reminders for our session today: if you have any questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A box. That way we won't lose track. As you can see, the chat moves very quickly. For any account or product related questions, please direct those to hello@prowritingaid.com. That email address will connect you directly to our support team. If you would like to chat with each other during the session today, and if our speaker has any interactions with you today during the presentation, that will happen in the chat. You are welcome to talk amongst yourselves and together. You'll want to update there's a drop-down menu next to the word to, where you can make sure you select everyone if you would like everyone to be able to see your messages. Otherwise, they will just come to the host and panelists. And any links or offers from our Nov ambassadors and sponsors are available in the community. And any links from this session will also be posted in the Zoom chat. All right, so without further ado, I'm so happy to introduce you to our speaker today. We are joined by Jed Herne. Jed Herne is a fantasy author from Perth, Western Australia. His books include Fires of the Dead, Across the Broken Stars, The Thunder Heist, and Kingdom of Dragons. He also wrote Siege of Chebulane, and an interactive fantasy novel published by Choice of Games. His YouTube videos on the craft of writing have received over 12 million views, and he's currently worked with over 200 writers through his classes and programs, helping many writers finish their books. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and Jed, you can take it away. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I noticed, I think it was Shannon in the chat also mentioned you were from Perth, Western Australia as well. So good to see somebody else from the most isolated city in the world. Let me get up my screen share and we can kick things off. Okay, is that coming across all right?
Yes, looks great.
Fantastic. Okay, so welcome everybody. Really excited to kick this off. My voice is a little bit dead at the moment, so hopefully it holds up throughout this session. Today I'm going to be talking about how to outline your novel using something I call the Hourglass method. And to start things off, I want to discuss the big problem that many writers face. So here we have a chart, and on one axis you can see your excitement levels to work on a particular book, and on the other axis you can see the progress you've made throughout your novel. And if you're like many writers, when you start your novel off, you're super excited. You have maybe thought about these characters for a long time, you're really eager to explore your world, Perhaps you have some really cool scene ideas or, action set piece ideas to kick things off. But then as you kind of progress through your story, if you're going through it and you don't really have much of a plan, you might get to this stage of not really knowing what do I write next. And as you sort of lack clarity around the next scenes to proceed with in your story, your excitement levels also begin to fade. I've had this come across with so many of the students I've worked with. This here is Arwen, one of the students who went through my outlining boot camp about a year and a half ago. And Arwen's experience is very typical of a lot of writers I see, where, he was really struggling to finish things. He was often getting like 20,000, 30,000 words into a book, and then just kind of having to abandon it because he wasn't really sure where it was going. And his story was beginning to sort of lack cohesion. He wasn't really sure of the direction of things, and he didn't really have a lot of confidence in his story. Now, obviously, the ideal point that you want to be at with your writing is to have pretty consistent levels of excitement throughout the whole process. Obviously, there's going to be ups and downs. You're not always going to be, 100% excited to work on a story, but ideally you want to maintain this consistent level of excitement as you go through your writing. And in my experience of now having published 4 fantasy books, that interactive fiction novel, Siege of Treblan, as mentioned at the start as well, I have found that my levels of excitement to write are very directly correlated with the clarity I have over what is happening next in my story. And so knowing how to outline properly, how to plan your novel so that you know what's happening, and so that you have that clarity over what is the next scene you're going to write today and tomorrow and from that point onwards, is one of the most useful skills that you can have as a writer. With my first book I wrote, The Aeon Academy here, I wrote it with no plan. It took me 360 days to write the first draft. And then that was followed by 4 years of editing and rewriting. I literally rewrote this book from scratch, I think 2 or 3 times. And it never really worked out because I just didn't get the big picture structure of it right from the start. By comparison with Across the Broken Stars, which was the second book I wrote, I decided to outline that. And as a result, it took me 60 days to write the first draft. It was a much easier edit. And eventually it was published. Here's a photo from the book launch and a couple of the reviews that it's had since then. And so not only has outlining been really useful for me as a writer, and I would consider it maybe the most valuable toolkit that I have learned over the 13 or 14 years I've been writing or so, but I've also taught my outlining process to dozens of students and dozens of writers in my boot camps, which are these 7-week programs where I work with about 8 or 10 writers at a time, and I basically walk them through the process of planning their novel, figuring out their plot, developing their characters, building their worlds, working on their themes, all of that sort of stuff. And to come full circle back to Arwen here, who went through the second cohort of my boot camp, thanks to the outline that we developed in that particular boot camp, he was able to finish his first proper fantasy novel, The Dragon and the Dead Man. I think this was a screenshot from earlier this year, or it might have been actually at the end of last year. And not only has that helped him for that particular project, but he's then been able to apply that same learning to future books he's written. So this is a screenshot from about midway through this year. Arwen mentioning here that he has written 140,000 words so far this year, which is more than he wrote in the entirety of the previous year. And it's not just Arwen. I've worked with so many students in my different programs over the last couple of years, and I've helped many of them finish their first drafts, which is an amazing milestone to reach. I think it's still to this day one of the most exciting moments in my writing career was finishing the first draft of the very first book I wrote on, because it just really shows you that you can actually do this. Like, you are capable of taking your ideas and bringing them to life. And so it all really comes down, in my opinion, to learning how to outline effectively. So what you're going to learn today is why outlining makes your writing more creative, not less, the big writing mistakes that outlining helps you to avoid, how to use story structure to keep readers engaged, how to write captivating character arcs that connect with readers on an emotional level, the secret to filling in the missing pieces of your story, and a lot more. My goal here is to help you outline your story in the next few weeks so that you can write your novel in November as part of Pro Writing Aid's Novel November Challenge. And as mentioned at the start, by the way, we're only going to really have like an hour today to talk. So if there is more stuff that you want to dive into, I've got a YouTube channel with like 300 plus videos on there with a lot more depth in terms of writing craft and talking about all the different aspects of writing your novel. So you're always more than welcome to check that out if you would like some more details. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about today, the Hourglass outlining method. You can see there's 3 distinct steps to this. Our first step is exploring the suburb. Our second step is finding your story's core. And then our third step is putting it all together. So we're going to go through this in a bit. But first of all, I just want to start by talking about what an outline should actually help you with. Because I think sometimes, writers are a bit afraid of outlining because they don't really know what it's designed to do or what it should be oriented towards. And so, in my opinion, an outline should be something that helps you know what to write. So that's kind of obvious, right? Like figure out where the ending of your story is, figure out the sort of steps to get there, and this will help you avoid the mistake of writing yourself into a corner or constructing a plot that makes no sense. But an outline should also help you know how to write it in the best way possible. So it should allow you to design your story in such a way that you are writing the best possible version of that book. And then lastly, and this is maybe the most underrated but important aspect of an outline, it should make you excited and motivated to write your story. And the reason why it's going to do that if you outline effectively is because when you know the kind of overall big picture aspect of your plot, and you kind of know that the overall structure of your story and your character arcs are working well, then it actually frees your mind a lot. It frees your mind because when you're writing each individual scene, you're no longer sitting there wondering, oh, does this make any sense? Does this all work? Does this build to something cohesive and meaningful? You kind of know that the overall big picture aspect of your story is solid. And so you can focus much more of your energy on the dialogue in your individual scenes, on, getting the sort of descriptions right, on making really nice prose and that sort of thing. And so these are the three things that I want you to keep in mind as we go through today's presentation. These are what you should be optimizing for as you go through the process of outlining. Now, in my opinion, the reason why an outline is so useful is because it really speeds up your write and edit feedback loop. So if you're like me, when I started out with my first novel, I just wrote the whole thing, kind of worked on it in isolation for an entire year, and then I looked back and I read over it and I realized that a lot of things weren't working. That's a very common experience. Maybe you've had it before with your own writing. And so that is quite a slow feedback loop, right? I'm spending a whole year working on something and then I'm looking at it, trying to figure out if it works or not. The benefit of outlining is that you can really speed that up. You can spend a couple of days once you know how to outline effectively, mapping out your story, figuring out the structure of things, and then looking at it and asking yourself, am I happy with this? Is this a story that I want to write? Is this a story that I want to read? And you can kind of go through this process a lot quicker. So rather than spending, a whole year of writing something before you're able to then look at it and figure out if you like the direction or not, you're able to construct different versions of your story. And if you kind of visualize this as a diagram here, you can imagine yourself testing out, 4 different versions of what your story might be. And with some of these variations, you decide, okay, I'm going to take some of these further. Some of these variations, you might decide, oh, they're not really that important. They're not really fitting with what I want to achieve for this story. You might reach a point where you begin combining some of these ideas. And ideally, the final outline that you result with at the end of this, or that you produce at the end of this rather, is something that combines the best aspects of all the different possible versions of what your story could be. So, with that being said, let's get into the first step of the Hourglass outlining method. And I call this first step exploring the suburb. Here, you're going to start by basically brain dumping everything that you know about your story so far. So interesting characters, cool scenes that you might have, any unique world building aspects. This is for, my fantasy and sci-fi writers out there, but it can apply to a lot of other genres as well. Any sort of creative magic systems you have, again, coming at this from my fantasy writing background here, the emotions you want readers to feel, and basically anything else that you have different concepts for with your story. Now, the goal here is really just loose exploration, right? At this stage of the process, it's all about the quantity of ideas and not necessarily about the quality of ideas. So you want to be really uninhibited with this, and you want to just be kind of like imagining all the different possible versions of what this story could be. Now, if you're in a position where you don't really know what to write, and maybe you've joined this challenge, you want to write a book in November, but you don't really know what that particular project should be yet, then the big questions to be asking at this stage of the process are, okay, well, what are your favorite stories? What do they have in common? And then what do you like about them? And also, what do I wish they did differently? You may also want to ask yourself, what if I combine some of these things as well? So I'll just get you to actually drop this in the chat as well. How many of you right now have a solid idea for what you are wanting to write in November? If you have a solid idea right now, just type yes in the chat. and I will get the chat up on my screen so I can actually see what's going on. Wow, there was a lot of messages coming through in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing quite a few people say yes, they've got a strong idea, um, but also plenty of people mentioning that, they're not too sure yet. Yeah, totally fair. So, this is an approach you can use regardless of whether you have a strong idea already or whether you are still trying to figure out what you write. And this approach is something called a trope brainstorm. So when I was writing this book here, The Thunder Heist, I just come off like a project where I had struggled with the writing of it a little bit. And I felt like I had kind of forced myself to pursue ideas in this previous story that, weren't that interesting to me. And so I really resolved to myself that, hey, with this next project I work on, I just want it to be something that is like pure fun from start to finish. And so, as you can see here on the screen, I literally got up my notebook and I just wrote down like, what are all the tropes and story ideas that I really find myself passionate about? And by the way, a trope is simply just an element of story here. Sometimes people say like tropes are bad or whatever, but all stories have tropes. It's kind of like saying, oh, I want to have a tree without wood. You can't have a story without tropes. If a trope's done poorly, then it becomes a cliche. But anyway, that's a little sidebar. So you can see here, I was just writing down, all the different stories and tropes that were exciting me the most. Things like, okay, I like really fast-paced stories. I like stories where there's an element of redemption in them. I like stories where they're mainly urban settings. I used to be an architect back in the day, so I really like being able to sort of just set a story in one city and be able to really go into depth with how that city operates. And so from all of those ideas, I came up with The Thunder Heist. And this book was probably the easiest book to write in my whole writing career so far. It took me 47 days to do the first draft, and the editing was pretty minimal after that because everything was just working really well from the start. And so it really shows that one of the greatest hacks that you can do as a writer is to just be telling a story that you're extremely passionate about. Because when you do that, you're going to find it so easy to be motivated and to be excited to work on your book every single day. At this point in the process, you also want to be thinking about selecting the right scope for this particular project. So, a couple of things to consider here with this. First of all, you always want to be writing the book that you're most passionate about, as I just talked about with the Thunder Heist. That's going to be the biggest way to easily have discipline, to easily form good writing habits, all of that sort of thing. But I think that if this is your first book, you may want to consider using just one point of view character and trying to do it as a standalone novel as possible. And also thinking about like, can I do this as a shortish book? In other words, you want to rig the game to make it easy to win. I think the challenge for Novel November is to write 50,000 words in November, right? So that's, a relatively short book, but I think it is very achievable to hit that goal. It's, 1,667 words in 30 days. And if you can do that, you're going to have a 50,000 word novel at the end of it. And so you want to be thinking at this stage of the process, if you're picking between a couple of different ideas and there's one idea which is going to be a little bit of an easier scope to write, it's going to have less complexity in the story. It's only going to have, less moving pieces and that sort of thing. I think it's really worthwhile approaching that if this is your first book, knowing that, okay, these projects with bigger scope, bigger complexity, they can always be attacked later in your writing career once you have figured out the basics of how to tell, a really good, more concise standalone story. The other thing that's really worthwhile thinking about at this stage in the process is something I call the triangle of story. So, if you think about what a story is made up of, it's sort of made up of these three pillars of character, setting, and plot, with theme created through the intersection of these. And this is a really useful brainstorming tool, actually, when you're at this part of the outlining process, because you might be finding yourself getting to the point where you're sort of stuck with your plot, for instance. And so, what you want to be doing when you get to that point of being stuck with, one of these aspects of the triangle of storytelling is go to the other points and ask yourself, how can you develop those further to help you out with this idea? So, for instance, if you have a setting, and we take something like the Thunder Heist, for example, which is set in a world where humanity is sort of living on this monster-infested sea. The main setting for this story is a floating city ship made of thousands of boats all lashed together, and it's sort of powered by this tower that harvests energy from lightning. That is my setting there. And my goal using the triangle of story is to try and make my character and my plot or my characters and my plotting really integrated with that setting as much as possible. So there'd be times when I'm outlining the story where, I found myself a little bit stuck with a character, for instance. And so what I could do is I could go back to my setting and ask myself, okay, well, given this sort of, the conditions I've created here within this book and the way in which humanity has been forced to live, how might that actually influence my character here? So always be finding ways to try and connect and create cohesion between your character, your setting, your plot, and your theme as much as possible as you go through the development stage of your story. So once you've gone through this initial phase of outlining, which again is all about just sort of exploring all the possible directions of what your story could be without really locking yourself into one pathway, your story is probably going to look a little bit like this. So it's just a cloud of, dots. Some of these dots are sort of connected to each other. You might have some relationships between characters, and that's where the lines are sort of coming out here. But in this initial phase of outlining, it's all just about volume and variety. No idea is bad. The only thing that's bad is not putting ideas down at this stage of the process. However, you're obviously not going to be able to write a story if it looks like this, right? It's just a little bit lacking in cohesion, and your ideas are sort of all over the place, and you don't really know at this stage what your story is about. So your goal is to compress that big sort of nebulous gas we just showed there down to something where you have a very tight understanding of what your story is. And this is going to allow you to make your story feel much more cohesive so that you can actually write it. So in other words, you want to find your story's core. So this is the second step of our Hourglass outlining method. Just take a sip of water here. And so finding your story's core is all about two big things. The first thing is developing your premise, and the second thing is refining your theme. Now, the reason why you want to be focusing on these two things is because they're going to give you really useful filters as you go through the writing process. So, to give some definitions, first of all, your premise is the external, what your story is about, and it's why readers come to your story in the first place. Your theme, on the other hand, is the internal, what the story means. What the story means. And it's why your story is going to stay with readers. So, in terms of your premise, I like to think of this as a one sentence summary of your story. And ideally, that one sentence is going to capture your main characters, the core conflict of your book, the plot that we're going to be going through, the stakes of the story as well. And the stakes are really crucial because that's sort of answering the, why should I care question about this story. So, to give a couple of quick examples here, Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, the premise I would describe for that as something like the following. A woman who can see the dead seeks justice for an unsolved murder by unraveling the twisted games of Yale's secret magical societies. So you can see there we've got the character, it's a woman. You can see the conflict, she's seeking justice for an unsolved murder. And there's kind of a suggestion of stakes there as well in the twisted games of Yale's secret magical societies. Okay, so maybe there's an aspect of conspiracy here that she has to uncover. To give another premise example from The Hobbit, a comfort-loving hobbit reluctantly agrees to help a wizard and a group of dwarves steal treasure from a dragon. Again, character, we've got the hobbit, we've got the dwarves, we've got the wizard, and we've got the antagonist set up here as well, the dragon. Speaking of dragons, from my own book, Kingdom of Dragons, a spy infiltrates a dragon rider academy to destroy it from within, but a forbidden romance will force him to choose between his loyalty and his heart. Now, it's really important to mention that you're never going to capture 100% of your story in your premise. And that's okay, because the goal with your premise is simply just to give you a focusing function to remind you of what your story's core is all about. And again, it's all about giving yourself this useful filter so that at different points in the writing process where you're deciding to go in one direction or another, you'll know which direction to go in because of the filtering benefits of your premise that it provides. So in terms of building your premise, the main things to be thinking about here, and if you're taking notes, I would really suggest that you write the following couple of questions down, is what does your main character want? Then add stakes. So why should we care? Include the setting, if that's important with the story, which in many cases it is, and then try to keep it as concise as possible. You'll see in all the examples I gave before, they're pretty brutally short. And again, you're never going to be able to capture like 100% of your story in your premise. You want to be also refining it and testing it as much as possible, getting feedback from other people too. Maybe that's something you can use the Pro Writing Aid community to go through and to give some feedback on each other's premise in there as well. Man, my voice is really going here. I hope that's not hope that's not too off-putting for you guys. I'm doing my best over here. Now, in terms of developing your theme is something that has a lot of misconceptions in writing. And a lot of people define theme as like this one word thing, like, oh, my theme is love, or my theme is greed, or my theme is power. And to me, that's not really what theme is. That's simply just describing the subject matter of your story. I prefer to think about theme in the way that John Truby defines it in The Anatomy of Story, which is to say, theme is a moral argument about how to live, and it is explored in different ways through your plot, your characters, your world, and all the other aspects of your story. Crucially, theme is not about cramming your morals down readers' throats. Rather, it is about exploring a complex question that you find really fascinating. And this adds a layer of philosophical conflict to your book. There are three big categories of theme. First of all, you have themes that are easy to agree with, but hard to live. The second type is a theme where you can kind of see all sides, where you can imagine yourself arguing for it, you can imagine yourself arguing against it. And then the third type of theme is the devil's advocate, where you're actually taking a idea that most people would probably disagree with on the surface, and then you're kind of making a case for why that idea is valid. So, if we look at some examples here, this is Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, one of his fantastic Discworld novels, a satirical fantasy book about sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself there. And the premise for this story I would describe as when the Hogfather, which is Discworld's version of Santa Claus, goes missing on the eve of Hogswatch, death fills in to preserve belief. So, if you're not familiar with Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, death is kind of this like personified, skeleton that's walking around collecting souls in this world. And he's a really, really interesting character. So, what's our theme for this story? Well, if we take a look at this next scene from the book, I think it really expresses it quite well. So, I'm going to read it to you now. My reading voice is a little bit off at the moment, but we'll see how we go. All right, said Susan. I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable. And so, when you see capitalized words like this in Discworld, it's death speaking. Really? As if it was some kind of pink pill? No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies? Hogfathers? Little? Yes, as practice. You have to start out learning to believe the little lies, so we can believe the big ones. Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder, and sieve it through the finest sieve, and show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, death waved a hand. And yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. But people have got to believe that, or what's the point? My point, exactly. And so this brings up the theme of the story in a really clearly expressed way, in my opinion, which is that humans need to believe in myths and stories, even if they are lies, to maintain our morality, which I would define as a category three theme of being a devil's advocate theme. So this is an idea that, on the surface, we might not really like the concept of, right? You might kind of react to it in a very negative way. And so it provides a lot of very interesting philosophical fuel for the story because you're then able to have different characters respond to this in different ways. So some characters, they're going to reject this thing as they go through the story. Other characters are going to embrace it. Some characters might go from rejecting it initially to actually understanding and accepting it by the end of the book. To give another example here, we've got Harry Potter, a book that I assume many of you are familiar with. Our premise is when the orphan boy Harry Potter learns that he's a wizard, he's thrust into a magical school where he uncovers a plot to return the world's most dangerous wizard to power. The theme I would describe for this story is true bravery comes from being willing to sacrifice your life to protect the ones you love. And I would put this in a category one theme. So easy to say, hard to live. And we see this expressed in lots of different ways in the story, right? So it's not just through Harry's arc, but we also see this being expressed through Ron, for instance, when he sacrifices himself at the giant chess game so that Harry can go ahead and, stop Snape from getting the Philosopher's Stone. And of course, in the end, it's not actually Snape who's trying to get the stone. Voldemort, on the other hand, he expresses the opposite of this theme. So Voldemort is actually trying to get other people to sacrifice themselves to protect himself. So again, it's showing how you can create polarity between your protagonist, your main character, and your antagonist, your sort of villain, through their different responses to the theme. One last theme example here, actually two more to go. We've got Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. The premise for this is about this street urchin who has to overthrow this invincible Lord Ruler. Our theme for this is that crime and deception are required to overthrow a corrupt system. And this is a category 2 theme, the kind of I can see all sides theme. I put it like that because, obviously when we're following our heroes as they're overthrowing the Dark Lord, we see them as heroic, but it's also the justification that, terrorists use when they're attacking people as well. And so that's why I put it in the kind of I can see all sides theme. From my own book, Across the Broken Stars here, the premise for this is desperate for redemption, a wingless, cowardly, middle-aged angel must help a young fugitive, the only other surviving angel, evade a ruthless inquisitor in a quest for a mythical safe haven. And the theme for this story is redemption is only possible by sacrificing yourself for an ideology that's bigger than you. Again, category 2, I can see all sides because you can very clearly argue against this and say, hey, that's also been, the main reason why we've had wars and bad events in the past. And that is a source of conflict in the story as well. So, I mentioned before how you can use theme as a guide here. The first way you can do that is by really relating it to your character arcs. So, for instance, in Across the Broken Stars, Leon, our main character, he goes from being very selfish and cowardly at the start of the story to learning how to be selfless and brave, which really works with that theme of redemption being possible through sacrificing yourself for a cause that's bigger than you are. As I mentioned with Harry Potter before, you can also be thinking about relating your main character and your antagonist to the same theme, but giving them sort of different interpretations of it. So, Harry learns that true bravery comes from sacrificing himself for others, whereas Voldemort never learns that. Voldemort is always trying to get other people to sacrifice themselves for him, and so that is why there is just this fundamental opposition between them. Whenever you're uncertain about the direction to take your story in, especially in the outlining phase, look at your theme and ask yourself, how can I explore this deeper? What are other angles on this theme here? And crucially, make sure that every side of your theme is equally strong. As I mentioned before, theme is not about cramming a particular moral message down readers' throats. It is about exploring this question and sort of raising this philosophical conflict for characters to grapple with in your book. Now, the last phase of sort of finding the core of your story here is to build something I call a one-page guiding principles document. So this here is the document on the left, is the actual guiding principles document I had for Across the Broken Stars. The title was a bit different back then. It was called Angels in the Stars back then. And the goal with this one-page guiding principles document is really just to get all of the important information about your story down onto one page. So I like to include my one-sentence premise, my theme, the main character arcs that I go through in the story. I'm going to be talking about character arcs in a little bit more detail later on today. The high-level synopsis, which is a spoiler-filled description of what happens in my story from start to end, and any other important notes that are going to help me really know how to proceed with my story. Okay, so this brings us to the third and last phase of the Hourglass outlining method. Just take a sip of water here. And this last phase is about putting it all together. So this is about kind of expanding back out from the core of your story. And the reason why, I brainstormed this or I've mapped this out as an hourglass is because you're sort of starting with all these ideas, you're filtering it down to understand what the core of your story is. And then once you understand your core, you're expanding back out to develop all the important parts of your story. So that's your characters, the plot and structure of things, fixing the gaps, and basically getting yourself ready to write. So let's move on to talking about character. What actually makes a good character? I'd love to see if you guys in the chat can just pop in some thoughts on what do you think makes for really good characters? And now we'll try to get the chat up on my screen over here. Oh, wow. Lots of comments through here. This is cool. Yeah, so I'm seeing Taryn saying a strong driving goal, Nicole saying morally grey, Isaac saying relatable, Liz saying believable. Got someone here saying their wants and needs, relatable and flawed, multidimensional. Yeah, lots of really, really good notes here. Wow, okay, there's like 100 comments here. I can't read through all of these, but these are awesome. So, yes, some of the things that you have just mentioned there are absolutely going to come up in my next couple of dot points, which is great. In my opinion, I think a great character is somebody who is very deeply connected to your triangle of story. So in other words, it's really hard to separate Harry Potter, for instance. It's very hard to separate Harry, the character, from the plot of struggling against Voldemort and the setting of being at Hogwarts, right? So that is a very connected triangle of story for that character. Um, I also think having a very distinctive voice and perspective and way of seeing the world is important. It's a good character is someone that we care about. So, that's all the relatable notes that were just coming up there. They're also someone who ideally has an element of uniqueness to them with their decisions, their motivations, their actions in the story, that kind of thing. They are rational. In other words, they act in character. They're not just doing random decisions that make no sense for them. They have interesting relationship dynamics with the other people in the story. And then we see them change and evolve as the book progresses. I'm actually writing a nonfiction book at the moment called Plotting Your Fantasy Novel with a ton more details about character development in there. So keep an eye out for that if you are writing a fantasy novel and you would like help with this. Uh, if you kind of boil it down to a fundamental level, most great stories are about a person wanting something, struggling to get it, and then being forced to change as a result. And the more interesting you make each of these three elements, so the character's goal, their motivations, the character's struggle and the conflict to get that, and then the change and the transformation they go through as a result of this, the better your character becomes. So this brings me to the idea of character arcs. And I like to think about character arcs as being comprised of 5 core components. The first component is the ghost. So this is some kind of influential past event that has massively shaped your character's worldview. Now, typically this is a sort of negative, traumatic event, but it doesn't always have to be. It just has to be something that happened in the past and has really defined the way that your character thinks of themselves or thinks of their place in the world. This leads to the character's lie. So as a result of the ghost, this influential past event, your character has formed a misconception about the way the world actually is. And this has led to them then having a want. So as a result of their lie and their ghost, they have a want, and they think that if they achieve this want, it will bring them happiness and peace and all that good stuff. What the character actually requires to be happy and fulfilled is their need. And the only way they can get to their need is by accepting the truth. So the truth is a more accurate way of seeing the world that serves as an antidote to the lie. I'm going to go over this in a lot more detail in a second, but you should know that there are 3 big character arc options that you can kind of use in your story. The first is a positive arc, where a character improves over the course of a story. So they go from being, cowardly at the start to brave at the end. The second type of arc is a negative arc, where a character becomes worse over the course of a story. So maybe they go from being really honorable at the start of the book to being really corrupt by the end of the book. The third type of arc is the steadfast arc. This is where your character doesn't really change that much from the start to end of the story, and the focus is more on how they impact the world around them or on how their beliefs are tested. So your character might be really, honorable at the start of the book. They might experience a lot of tests throughout the book, but they maintain their honor by the end. And the focus is more on how their honor is impacting the other characters around them. So in terms of structuring a positive arc, at the start of your book, your character is fully believing their lie as a result of their ghost. They are ignorant of the truth, and they are pursuing their want. However, as the story progresses, they're going to gradually realize that their lie is actually hurting them, and so they'll begin sort of flirting with the truth. However, it's not so easy to just jump over the truth. The truth is going to be challenged a lot by the other characters in the story. They'll be tempted to return to the lie, and the climax is really about a decision of, do I pick the truth or do I return to the comforting embrace of my lie? And because it's a positive arc, they pick the truth and they reject the lie. To give an example of this, if we look at Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit, he goes through this arc of beginning in a place of comfort, learning to develop courage, and then really ending the story as a bit of a hero. So his ghost at the start of this book is the fear of the unknown world that lies beyond the Shire. So the lie he tells himself is that adventures are unnecessary, they're dangerous, I'm meant to live a quiet hobbit life without danger or disturbance. His want is to maintain his peaceful, uneventful life in the Shire. But the need he has is to really embrace a sense of adventure, to step out of his comfort zone, and to find courage to grow and become a true hero. So the truth he accepts by the end of the story is courage and a sense of adventure are qualities that lie within him, and he can actually accomplish great deeds. Now, by comparison, structuring a negative arc. At the start of a negative arc, your character actually already believes in the truth. right? So you'd think they'd be good because they also have their need as well. But then the lie is introduced to them. They're tempted by the lie, they begin chasing their want and ignoring their need. The lie slowly overtakes the truth, and the climax offers them one last moment to potentially return to the truth and reject the lie. But the want is too tempting, so they fully embrace the lie and they reject the truth. Great example of a negative arc is Call Shivers from Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. He is this Northman warrior who seeks to leave his violent past behind by traveling to this other country. But when he travels there, he's sort of pulled back into this cycle of vengeance and brutality when he falls in with this mercenary who is on this ruthless quest for revenge. So his arc is one of naivete to courage to love to despair to anger. So his ghost is his violent past as a warrior in the north, and the truth that he comes to Styria, which is the country he sort of migrates to at the start of the story, is that he can build a new, peaceful life if he stops using violence to find purpose. His need is to let go of his anger and ego and move on from his violent past. And we actually see him doing this perfectly fine at the start of the story. He arrives off the boat. He's really excited to be in this new country, even though it's not quite as, appealing as it was described to him. People take advantage of him. He's like, no, I'm not going to be violent. I'm trying to be a better man. But as the story progresses, he is tempted again by his want, which is to regain respect, regain power, regain affection from other people. And so by the end of the story, once he's sort of been swept up with this mercenary, he sort of falls in love with her. They have a very difficult relationship. He commits some really brutal murders. And we have this bit of dialogue exchange between him and that mercenary at the end of the story, where he says, I reckon I've learned just to stick at the place I'm at, just to be the man I'm at. She asks, what's that? And he says, a killer. So you can see he's kind of regressed down into this tragic lie. And then lastly, in terms of structuring a steadfast arc, your character at the beginning of the story fully believes their truth already, and they probably already have their need. But unfortunately, the world believes the lie. And so conflict ensures. The world attempts to reinforce the lie. Your character's truth is challenged, but because it's a steadfast arc, they are remaining steadfast. And so this really leads you to one or two options here, or two different options here. Option one is the truth triumphs. So your character manages to exert their personal beliefs on the world and the lie is vanquished. You see this all the time in like serial detective stories, right? So, the detective is not really changing their worldview over the course of a book, but the world is attempting to kind of get away with murder and brutality, and the detective is trying to exert justice onto that. And so the reason why a lot of serial stories work well is because your character believes a truth that the world like rarely believes. And so it's all about them just constantly coming in and trying to exert that on the world. But the other option you have is that the lie is too strong for your character and it vanquishes their truth and your character is defeated. It could be like an actual defeat, like they're killed, or it could be more of like a moral defeat, like they lose the court case or they fail to solve the crime. A great example of a steadfast arc is Ned Stark from A Game of Thrones, and his arc is one of honor, conviction, and then spoilers, although I'm sure all of you are aware of this by this stage, death at the very end of the first book. And so he is this honorable lord who really values duty and justice above all, and he has a very strong commitment to his oaths and his principles, but eventually that leads to his downfall. So the ghost of Ned Stark is his loyalty to King Robert Baratheon, and so he kind of has this truth that we must do what is right, no matter the cost. So his need at the start of the story, which again, he retains his truth and his need throughout the whole book, is to remain true to his oaths. The lie that the world advocates and the lie that the world tries to pressure him into accepting is that, hey, we're in a political game here. Sometimes our oaths should bend for the greater good. And the want that sort of tempts him to go towards the lie is to stop Westeros from falling back into war. So there are many times where he realizes that, if I accept the lie and I allow my oaths to bend for the greater good and I lie or, I reveal an uncomfortable thing, it's maybe going to prevent Westeros from going back into this brutal civil war. But if eventually at the end of the story, he is still too stuck to his truth of we must do what is right no matter the cost. And it eventually leads to his execution, right? Like he loses this political game because he's not willing to use the tools of his enemies. So with all this character arc stuff, I've actually got a video on my YouTube channel called how to write character arcs better than 99% of fantasy writers, where I go through this in a lot more detail. So feel free to check that out if you want. But we're going to move on to, in this last section of the outlining presentation here, we're going to be talking about story structure. Now, story structure to me is all about giving you a scaffold to express your ideas in the best way possible. And the benefit of knowing story structure is that it's not something where, if you use the right approach, it's not something where it is this kind of artificial thing that is imposed on your story from without, but rather it is something that grows organically from your character's desires and sort of follows the fundamental patterns of how we experience desire, conflict, and change in our own lives. And it really helps to solve the missing pieces of your story. Because when you use a story structure like the one I'm about to show you here, it kind of gives you these anchor points throughout your story where you can know what to target at different phases of your writing. Again, much more detail about this structure in my book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, which will hopefully be released in the next few months. I think I've written like a good 50,000 words on this particular structure system in that book. But I'm going to give you an overview now in the last couple of minutes of this presentation. So, this is 9 point story structure. It's something I've been using for my writing for the last couple of years, and I think it has a lot of advantages over the traditional kind of 3-act structure stuff you might see, or the hero's journey stuff that you might have seen as well. Namely, it has a lot more sort of points in the middle section of your story, which allows you to avoid that kind of soggy middle syndrome by giving you much more direction for what to do there. So, to go through this, your story starts with your opening hook. This is where you introduce your main character with a defining moment that establishes why we should care about them, sort of shows their flaws, their desires, and the rough direction of where they're going to be heading in the story. So, in other words, their character arc. I'm going to be using examples from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban as we go through this 9 point structural breakdown, because I think it's the best plotted Harry Potter book here. The opening book for this particular, the opening hook for this particular book is we meet 13-year-old Harry Potter. He's an orphan wizard who hates summer holidays, has to do his homework in secret, sort of under the cover of his bed sheets, because he lives with the miserable Dursleys who hate magic. And in this opening chapter, he gets birthday letters from his friends. One of his friends' letters includes a newspaper article which shows a photo of his family in Egypt, and it shows Ron with his pet rat Scabbers, which comes back later in the story. Sorry, just take a sip of water there. All right. Hopefully make it through the rest of this without dying. This leads to our inciting incident. So this is where you disturb your character's ordinary world by presenting them with a challenge or invitation, forcing them onto some kind of journey. So in the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens when Harry's horrible Aunt Marge comes to visit and she insults Harry's dead parents. Harry loses control. He magically inflates her like a balloon. She floats off into the sky, and panicking about being expelled from Hogwarts because you're not supposed to use magic outside of the school, Harry runs away into the dark streets around Privet Drive, and he spots this massive black dog who's watching him. He panics, he falls over, accidentally summons the night bus, this sort of magical transportation for wizards, which takes him to Diagon Alley. Here he learns about the escaped convict, Sirius Black. This leads us to the entering the new realm moment. So this is where your protagonist crosses over some kind of threshold and steps into a new world where the rules are different. So in the case of Harry Potter, just before returning to Hogwarts, Harry overhears that Sirius Black has been saying he's at Hogwarts in his sleep and wants Harry dead. So on the train to Hogwarts, a Dementor attacks Harry, causing him to hear screams and pass out. He is saved by Professor Lupin, a new teacher there. But Harry basically learns that the Ministry of Magic has sent Dementors to guard Hogwarts against Sirius Black. And so it brings all of these new anxieties to this previously safe haven that he's really treasured. So this moment, it really fundamentally changes Harry's relationship with Hogwarts by introducing the Dementors as these key antagonists for him to overcome. And that crosses us over into Act 2 of the story. Next, we have the rising danger moment. So this is all about giving your antagonist a moment to shine, where you show their danger and you show how they are uniquely skilled at exploiting your main character's specific weaknesses. So in the case of Harry Potter, we see this when Sirius Black slashes at the fat lady's portrait while trying to enter Gryffindor Tower, which is where Harry and all his friends sleep, and it proves that he can infiltrate Hogwarts' defenses despite the Dementor guards. Shortly after this, during a Quidditch match, Harry sees the black dog again, which is the same black dog he saw at the start of the story, watching him in the stands. And shortly after, over 100 Dementors swarm the pitch, causing Harry to fall from his broomstick and black out. So here, we're getting escalating threats from both Sirius Black and from seeing the Dementor's devastating effect on Harry, because now when they are near him, he's starting to hear his dead mother's screams in his mind, which is not particularly pleasant, as you can imagine. This brings us to your midpoint revelation. This is all about giving your protagonist an important epiphany about where they confront a buried truth about themselves or gain clarity about the antagonist. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, we see this when Harry sneaks out to Hogsmeade and he eavesdrops on this conversation where he learns Sirius Black, the mad, escaped convict, worker, servant of Voldemort who killed Harry's father and his mother. Sirius Black was actually the best friend of Harry's father and Harry's own godfather in the past. And in fact, Sirius Black was his parents' secret keeper. So he was the one who was sort of concealing their location from Voldemort, but he betrayed their location to Voldemort, which led to Voldemort killing Harry's parents. And when another one of Harry's parents' friends, Peter Pettigrew, confronted Sirius Black, Sirius killed him and he left only a finger behind. So this revelation completely reframes Sirius Black from just being this, random antagonist to being a very personal betrayer for Harry. So at this point, Harry finally understands the true stakes he's facing, and he finally understands his emotional connection to the conflict. So it really changes him from just being this passive victim to being someone who has like a personal investment in catching Sirius Black and developing a lot of anger and a bit of a grudge towards him. This leads us to our sixth structural moment, the deepening pressure. So this is where your antagonist is applying amplified pressure to test your main character's developing perspective, driving them into a dark night of the soul moment where everything seems lost. So again, it sort of mirrors the rising danger moment. Like the rising danger moment, this is all about giving your antagonist a moment to shine and really show their threat. So in the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, we have this scene where Ron wakes up in the Gryffindor common room to see Sirius Black holding over him with a knife, standing over him with a knife. Ron escapes unharmed after Sirius flees, but this near miss shows how close Sirius came to reaching Harry. Although Harry kind of wonders, like, how come Sirius didn't kill Ron and move on to him? Sirius is this, notorious mass murderer, and he killed lots of innocent people in the past. Something strange is afoot here. We also learn that Hagrid's beloved Hippogriff Buckbeak has been condemned for execution by the Ministry of Magic, and this plunges Harry, Ron, and Hermione into a lot of despair. So they begin to sort of frantically help with this last-minute appeal for Buckbeak, and this dual pressure from both the main plot and the subplot really drives them towards the darkest moment so far. Next, we have the final spark. So just when everything seems lost, your protagonist encounters a key realization or clue, giving them the final puzzle piece needed to defeat the antagonist and set course for the climactic confrontation. So this is all about pushing your character over the threshold between the middle of your story and the end. In the case of the Prisoner of Azkaban, this happens when exams end, Hagrid writes to Harry and the others saying Buckbeak is going to be executed tonight. While the other students are sort of celebrating finishing their exams, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, they just feel dread. So when Harry receives Hagrid's letter, he says, I'm going to go down and help them. I don't care that it's unsafe for me to be out. And while Harry doesn't realize it, this choice is going to trigger the final climactic confrontation with Sirius Black and the Dementors. And so it's pushing our characters from over the threshold from Act 2 into Act 3 of the story. And you can kind of see here with this structure how these points sort of mirror each other, right? So, the final spark is about crossing a threshold, and entering the new realm is also about crossing a threshold. So you can almost conceive this story structure as a bit of a ring in many ways. This leads to the climax. So the climax, pretty straightforward. It's the final confrontation between your protagonist and antagonist, and it resolves the core conflict of your story. So in the case of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, we have a pretty long climactic sequence for this. It all kicks off with the crew going down to Hagrid's hut, where they find Ron's supposedly dead rat Scabbers, who is actually alive. As they all leave before the executioner arrives, the black dog that Harry has been seeing all year attacks, and he drags Ron and Scabbers to the Shrieking Shack. Harry and Hermione follow. They discover the dog is actually Sirius Black, who can transform into an animal. And they also discover that their Professor Lupin has been a werewolf and has been hiding this from them all year. We learn that Scabbers is actually Peter Pettigrew, the real betrayer of Harry's parents, who framed Sirius for betraying their location to Voldemort, and he's been hiding as Ron's pet for all these years. Sirius and Lupin, they want to kill Peter Pettigrew, but despite Harry earlier wanting to kill Sirius for his role in his parents' death, Harry spares Pettigrew, and this really shows his growth and his maturation over the course of the story. But as if you're familiar with the book, things are not over yet. So as they leave, Dementors begin to swarm Harry and Sirius, and they're almost killed. But then Harry sees a figure who looks like his father cast a Patronus to save them. And the Patronus is this spell that Harry has been struggling with all year. So Harry basically blacks out, wakes up in the hospital wing, finds out that it's too late to save Sirius. He's about to be executed. But fortunately, he's able to travel back in time using Hermione's time turner, which she has been using throughout the whole year to kind of attend multiple classes at the same time. It's actually quite well foreshadowed in the book. I realize I've just sort of brought it up here and it feels a bit convenient, but it is well foreshadowed in the book. And so Harry travels back in time to basically see his father come to save his past self. But when the time arrives, he realizes his father's not there, and he discovers that it was actually him from the future. So he's able to step forward. He saves his past self by casting a powerful Patronus that is fueled by his love for his newfound godfather, finally conquering his fear of the Dementors. This leads us to our closing image. This is all about providing closure by showing your transformed protagonist in their new reality, contrasting with the opening image to show how things have changed. In the case of Harry Potter, we see this when Harry is riding home with his friends on the Hogwarts Express, and he gets a letter from Sirius, finally giving him official permission to visit Hogsmeade. Not that it has stopped Harry from sneaking there all throughout the last year. So this really contrasts perfectly with the opening chapter where, Harry didn't really have that familial connection. He was with the Dursleys, but they kind of hated him. Now Harry has gained a proper sort of father figure for the first time in his life. Much more details about this plot structure in Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. Again, like I mentioned before, aiming to release it before the end of 2025. You can join the waitlist by going to jedherne.com/plot. And yes, it is specifically for fantasy writers, but there's lots of relevance no matter what genre you're writing in there. Like I mentioned at the start as well, I have a YouTube channel with like 300 plus videos on there, breaking down the craft of writing in a lot more detail. That's the link there as well. And that basically brings me to the end of my presentation here. Made it without my voice dying, which is fantastic. And I believe we might have time for a bit of Q&A here.
We do. Thank you so much, Jed. And I feel you. I have been a little under the weather all week. It's so hard whenever you feel like you can't finish a sentence without coughing. But you've done great, so don't worry.
Fantastic.
All right, we
Straight on
have
my screen.
some Q&A here. If you haven't gotten your question in yet, we only have a few minutes left, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And just know also that Jed does have some additional sessions coming up, including an asynchronous Q&A in the community. So if your question doesn't get answered tonight, you can come back with it later. You can also post it in the asynchronous community post where we are collecting those questions. All right. So our first question is from an anonymous attendee who says, different genres require different plot progressions. How do you navigate dual genre outlines with this method?
Yeah, so the way I think about, well, pardon me, the way I think about genre is that you have your presentational genre, which is the surface level aesthetics of what your story is. So that might be something like, it's a high fantasy book, or it's a crime story, or it's a science fiction novel. Then you have your schematic genre, which is the sort of underpinning structural engine of your story. So your schematic genre might be, this is a romance. It's about two characters falling in love. This is a crime story. It's about a crime being solved. And of course, a crime story could take place in a sci-fi novel, in a fantasy novel, in something else. This is a redemption story. It's about someone learning to become better. And so really, I would say that in terms of the sort of way you're progressing your plot, it has far more to do with your schematic genre than it has to do with your presentational genre. So the reason why it's useful to break it out that way is because once you kind of understand what your schematic genre is, you're able to then look at other stories that use a similar schematic genre, and you're able to see like how they have progressed their plot. So for instance, writing something like The Thunder Heist, the schematic genre of this is a heist story, right? So I'm able to then look at things like Ocean's 11, The Lies of Locke Lamora, The Sting, different types of heist stories, and I'm able to look at the structure of it and go, okay, well, how are they setting things up? How are they setting up the character's motivation? How are they sort of, building the climactic sequence. Oh, okay, it's really interesting. All the climaxes for these stories seem to have a false defeat where the main characters, they seem to lose at the objective they're attempting to reach, but that's actually all part of the plan. And so you're then able to look at that and understand, okay, these are the things that readers sort of expect from the story. I am going to, you know, agree with some of those expectations. I'm going to deliver on some of those expectations. And then there's others that I might decide to subvert. So I would say, yeah, when it comes to knowing how to adjust your plot for different genres, first of all, understand the distinction between the presentational genre of your story and then the schematic genre, which is actually driving things. And then look at other stories of that schematic genre and use that as a bit of a template for knowing how to arrange things in your plot.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more. Nicole asks, how would you write a story outline for a short stories collection?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I guess I haven't really thought about my outlining process for short stories that much. I would say in a short story, it's still a very similar process, right? Oh, you're saying a short story collection, so multiple short stories here. I'm going to assume you're meaning something like, okay, I'm going to have like a, overall theme for all these different short stories, but I'm going to explore lots of different versions of that. I would still go through the same process of, spending a little bit of time exploring all the different versions of what these stories could be, then figuring out the core of what I want these stories to be about. And then in terms of using the 9 point story structure that I mentioned, you can still use that for short stories. It's just obviously going to be much more abbreviated, right? So, if you're writing like Kingdom of Dragons, for instance, that's like 700-page fantasy novel. The 9 story points in that, they're going to be more spread out and there's going to be gaps between them in the story. In a short story, the 9 points we've gone through previously, those might actually be all completely covered in the space of like 2,000 words. So there might not be like as much time for each particular point, if that makes sense. But yeah, honestly, that's something I'd probably have to think about a bit more. I haven't really written a short story in quite some time.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to preserve your voice and let
Thank
you
you.
go, Jed. But thank you so much for joining us. This was lovely, and we've received so much amazing positive feedback for this session in the chat. We will have the recording posted to the Nov event replays section in the community as soon as it is done processing from Zoom and YouTube. And Jed has more sessions coming for Novel November, so check
Yes.
those out. They're Q&As, so if you didn't get your question answered today, come back with those questions for those sessions and we'll hopefully get to them. But thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow for more sessions and we'll see you in the community. Have a lovely rest of your night or morning, wherever you are, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. This was a pleasure.